For more than a century, one triangular tower has defined the skyline of New York City. At the intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway, where the rigid grid of Manhattan collides with a wandering diagonal road, a limestone wedge rises into the sky. The Flatiron Building is more than architecture. It's an icon. Photographed endlessly, painted, filmed, studied, and admired. Children recognize its silhouette before they even know its name. It survived wars, it survived economic crashes, it survived demolition threats. But survival is not the same as life. Since 2019, the Flatiron has stood empty. Dark windows, silent halls, waiting. This is the story of what happens when a building becomes too historic to tear down and too complicated to save. Before the Flatiron, the land it occupies was considered nearly useless. In 1811, Manhattan was carefully mapped into a rigid grid, straight streets running east to west, avenues stretching north to south. It was orderly, rational, modern. But one road refused to cooperate. Broadway, originally a Lenape trail, cut diagonally across the island along a natural ridge. Where Broadway sliced through the grid, awkward triangular lots appeared. Most were ignored or filled with low, forgettable structures. Developers preferred rectangles. Office furniture fits against straight walls. Tenants prefer predictable rooms. Triangles were inefficient, uncomfortable, financially risky. The lot at 23rd Street was the most awkward of them all. At its southern tip, it narrowed to just 29 feet wide. The base stretched roughly 190 feet along Broadway and 190 feet along Fifth Avenue. In total, just over 18,000 square feet. Sizable in theory, but in practice a long, thin wedge. For decades, a modest residential building occupied the site. Nothing ambitious, nothing tall. The shape discouraged bold ideas. That changed in 1899. The George A. Fuller Company, a Chicago construction firm, specialized in something revolutionary: steel skeletal construction. Instead of relying on thick masonry walls to bear weight, they used internal steel frames. This allowed buildings to rise higher while using less material, a breakthrough that was reshaping American cities. After the death of founder George Fuller in 1900, leadership passed to Harry S. Black. Black understood something crucial. A headquarters wasn't just an office. It was a statement, a declaration of capability. If the company could build something extraordinary on an impossible lot, clients would believe they could build anything. So Black purchased the triangular parcel at 23rd Street, purportedly for a modest sum since few others saw its potential, and immediately sought the right architect. He chose one of the most respected names in American design, Daniel Burnham. Burnham had earned national acclaim after designing major portions of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. He understood spectacle. He understood scale. And he understood how to merge classical beauty with modern engineering. When presented with the bizarre triangular site, he didn't hesitate. The height wasn't the problem. A 22-story structure was entirely feasible with steel framing. The real challenge lay at the base. How do you anchor a tall building when one end narrows to just 29 feet? Burnham and his engineers devised a solution using deep steel piles driven into Manhattan's bedrock. Instead of spreading the load outward, the structure would drive it downward. The building would stand not by width, but by depth. Then came the facade. Burnham chose a French Renaissance style, emphasizing vertical lines that made the building appear even taller. The lower floors were clad in Indiana limestone, a material associated with prestige and permanence. Above, terracotta panels provided both fire resistance and decorative flexibility, offering elegance at a lower cost than carved stone. As construction began in 1901, critics mocked the project. Newspapers labeled it Burnham's Folly. They warned that strong winds would topple the narrow tower. Some predicted it would collapse before completion. The skepticism wasn't irrational. No one had built something like this on such a strange footprint. But the steel frame rose quickly. Floor by floor, the triangle climbed into the Manhattan sky, and instead of swaying dangerously, it proved stable, strong, elegant. When completed in 1902, the building didn't just occupy space, it transformed it. The odd intersection of Fifth Avenue and Broadway suddenly became dramatic. The narrow prow of the building sliced through the air like the bow of a ship. Wind currents swirling around the structure famously lifted skirts in the early 20th century, drawing crowds and giving rise to urban legends. The once useless lot became one of the most photographed corners in the world. Over time, the nickname stuck, the Flatiron. It became a symbol of New York's boldness, proof that constraints could produce creativity, that awkward geometry could inspire innovation, that risk could redefine a skyline. Architects studied it. Tourists traveled to see it. Preservationists fought fiercely to protect it when modernization threatened older buildings across the city. They succeeded. The Flatiron survived. Yet, in the 21st century, a new challenge emerged, not structural, but economic. Narrow floor plates, aging infrastructure, and expensive renovations made modern office conversion difficult. Tenants left. By 2019, the lights went out. The building still stands, magnificent, protected, untouchable, but empty. And that raises a haunting question. What happens when an icon becomes so cherished that no one dares alter it, yet too outdated for modern life? The Flatiron was born from impossible geometry and bold ambition. It proved critics wrong. It redefined a neighborhood. It became a global symbol. Now it waits for its next chapter, a reminder that even the most celebrated landmarks must evolve or risk becoming monuments not to greatness, but to memory. The transformation of the triangular lot at 23rd Street was nothing short of dramatic. Crews began by excavating deep into the earth, cutting through layers of rubble and fill until they reached Manhattan's hard bedrock. Steel piles were driven downward with precision. Concrete was poured around them, locking the structure into the island itself. What critics had mocked as unstable would rest on one of the firmest foundations in the city. By early 1901, steel columns began rising into the air. Floor after floor, the skeletal frame climbed higher, each beam bolted into place with mechanical confidence. The pace was astonishing. Within months, the structure towered over Madison Square, its triangular outline against the sky. At the center of it all stood Daniel Burnham, overseeing every detail. Nothing was left to chance. Terracotta panels were manufactured to his exact specifications. Windows were carefully positioned to flood offices with daylight while minimizing interior heat. A modern elevator system connected all 22 floors. Steam heating and indoor plumbing, luxuries for the era, ensured comfort. This was not merely an experiment in engineering. It was a statement about the future of urban life. On October 1st, 1902, the building officially opened. The skepticism evaporated almost overnight. The structure stood firm. The winds that swept across Madison Square did not topple it as critics had predicted. Instead, those winds created something unexpected. As air rushed around the narrow prow of the building, it accelerated, forming powerful gusts at street level. Women walking past found their skirts suddenly lifted by surprise drafts. Young men gathered at the corner to watch, prompting police to disperse them. According to popular lore, officers shouted 23 skidoo, a phrase that soon entered American slang, though historians still debate its exact origin. What had been mocked as Burnham's Folly was suddenly the most talked about building in New York City. Cameras arrived almost immediately. The Flatiron Building seemed designed for photography. From Madison Square, its full triangular form could be captured in perfect symmetry. From street level, it appeared monumental, soaring above pedestrians like the bow of a steel ship cutting through an urban sea. One of the first major artists to immortalize it was Alfred Stieglitz, who photographed the building in 1903. His images transformed it from an engineering marvel into a subject of fine art. Soon others followed. Edward Steichen depicted it shrouded in mist, moody and atmospheric. Alvin Langdon Cockburn captured it at twilight, its illuminated windows glowing softly against the darkening sky. John Sloan painted it from his studio window, showing the structure dominating the square below. Within just a few years, the Flatiron Building appeared in more works of art than many monuments that had stood for centuries. It was no longer just a building. It was a symbol. Inside, business flourished. The George A. Fuller Company occupied several floors, while the rest were leased to firms eager for a prestigious address. Publishers were especially drawn to the building. The narrow floor plates, once considered a disadvantage, proved well suited for rows of desks and filing cabinets. Rents were moderate for such a prominent location, and offices filled quickly. The name Fuller Building was official, but the public preferred something else. The triangular shape defined its identity, and soon Flatiron Building became the name everyone used. Behind its elegance was a technological revolution. Traditional tall buildings relied on thick masonry walls to support their weight. The taller the structure, the thicker those walls had to be at the base, sometimes so thick they consumed valuable interior space. Height came at the cost of usability. Steel changed everything. Instead of load-bearing walls, vertical steel columns and horizontal beams formed a rigid internal skeleton. The exterior walls became lightweight curtains attached to the frame rather than supporting it. This innovation allowed architects to build higher while preserving interior space. The concept was pioneered in 1885 with William LeBaron Jenney with Chicago's Home Insurance Building, widely considered America's first skyscraper. By the time Burnham began work in New York, skeletal construction had proven itself reliable. The Flatiron used steel columns distributed across its triangular footprint. Beams connected them on every level, creating a rigid frame. Concrete floors rested on this grid, and the entire load transferred downward into foundations anchored in bedrock. The exterior walls bore no structural weight. Material choices were equally strategic. The upper floors were clad in terracotta, lighter than stone, reducing strain on the steel frame. Terracotta could be molded into intricate decorative forms and, once fired at high temperatures, became fireproof, an essential feature in an era when urban fires were common. The lower 4 floors were wrapped in Indiana limestone, projecting stability and prestige. Burnham divided the facade into 3 classical sections. The base, 4 stories tall, featured limestone walls and expansive ground-floor windows for shops. The middle section, stretching from the 5th to the 18th floor, displayed repeating terracotta columns that emphasized verticality. The top 4 floors were crowned with ornate detailing and a projecting cornice that completed the composition. The proportions were classical. The structure beneath was modern. Windows covered much of the exterior. At a time when electricity was expensive and unreliable, natural light was essential. Burnham carefully positioned openings to maximize daylight while maintaining structural integrity. Thick steel window frames divided each opening into smaller panes capable of withstanding wind pressure at height. And the wind was no small concern. Madison Square created open channels for air currents, intensifying gusts around the building's narrow edge. Engineers had anticipated this challenge, designing a frame rigid enough to resist sway. The result was extraordinary. What began as an awkward triangle became one of the most innovative structures of its era. A site once dismissed as impractical transformed into a masterpiece of engineering and art. The Flatiron proved that limitations could inspire brilliance, and that bold design anchored in solid technology could silence even the loudest critics. When the wind struck the narrow northern tip of the Flatiron Building, it didn't simply pass by, it accelerated. Air funneled around the sharp prow, rushing down the sides and exploding outward at street level. The effect was dramatic. Newspapers reported hats flying into the street. Women clutched their skirts against sudden gusts. Curious young men gathered on the sidewalks to witness the spectacle until police stepped in to disperse them. What critics once claimed would topple the building instead made it unforgettable. Step inside and the drama continued, though in quieter ways. The triangular footprint dictated everything. There were no large rectangular floors, no predictable office grids. Instead, each level stretched from a broad southern base to a narrow northern point connected by long corridors. Offices lined the hallways like slices of a pie. At the northern tip, rooms became so small they could fit little more than a single desk and filing cabinet. For large corporations seeking expansive open departments, the layout was impractical. But for others, it was perfect. Publishers, small law firms, architects, and independent professionals discovered that the unusual geometry worked in their favor. They didn't need vast open halls. They needed privacy, focus, and prestige. And prestige was something the address delivered effortlessly. Madison Square carried weight. Being located at 23rd Street at one of the most recognizable intersections in New York City elevated a company's image overnight. Rent was reasonable compared to other modern office towers. Public transportation was close. Restaurants and theaters surrounded the area. The inconvenience of triangular rooms was a small price to pay. The George A. Fuller Company occupied several floors as its New York headquarters. The remaining spaces filled quickly. By 1905, the building was nearly fully leased. What had once been dismissed as a foolish experiment had become prime real estate. Outside, the building's fame exploded. It became a reference point for directions. Meet me by the Flatiron. Walk past the Flatiron and turn left. Its silhouette defined the intersection. Postcards bearing its image sold by the thousands. Travel guides featured it prominently. Brochures promoting New York as a modern metropolis placed the triangular tower front and center. Even those who had never visited the city could recognize its shape instantly. Artists continued to find inspiration in it year after year. Winter blanketed the terracotta in snow. Spring softened its edges with gentle light from Madison Square. Autumn sunsets bathed the facade in gold and crimson. Each season, each hour, each angle revealed something new. The building was constant, yet always changing. Its success proved several powerful truths. First, a site considered useless could become extraordinary when guided by bold vision and sound engineering. Second, prestige has value. Tenants were willing to adapt to awkward layouts in exchange for an address that impressed clients. And third, the public responds to courage in design. Burnham's Folly became an icon not despite its strange shape, but because of it. For its first 2 decades, the building functioned exactly as intended, an advertisement for the Fuller Company's expertise and a profitable investment. Maintenance remained straightforward. The steel skeleton required less structural intervention than traditional masonry towers. Terracotta cladding weathered the seasons well. Fires that ravaged other Manhattan buildings spared this one, thanks to its fire-resistant materials. Elevators operated reliably. Steam heat kept offices warm through harsh winters. It simply worked. By the 1920s, however, the skyline was changing. New towers began rising higher and higher. The Empire State Building would eventually soar to 381 meters when it opened in 1931. The Chrysler Building reached over 300 meters with its gleaming Art Deco crown. At 77 meters, the Flatiron was no longer even close to the tallest structure in Manhattan. Yet it remained the most photographed. Its height was part of the secret. Tall enough to dominate Madison Square, modest enough to preserve a human scale. It didn't overwhelm, it engaged. It felt accessible, almost companionable, even as it stood apart. For nearly 60 years, the building pulsed with activity. Tenants came and went, but occupancy remained consistently high. The businesses inside reflected the evolution of Manhattan itself. Publishers dominated the early decades. Among them was the Frank Munsey Company, whose magazines, including Munsey's Magazine, reached circulations of hundreds of thousands. Editorial work suited the narrow offices perfectly. Journalists needed desks, typewriters, and filing cabinets, not sprawling floors. The 23rd Street address lent credibility and visibility to their publications. Architectural firms also leased space, an irony that wasn't lost on anyone. Working inside one of America's most celebrated buildings signaled taste and authority. Clients visiting the offices experienced design excellence before discussions even began. The compact rooms allowed for private consultations, while shared spaces hosted presentations and reviews. Photographers set up studios on the upper floors, drawn by the abundance of natural light pouring through large windows. The Midtown location made it convenient for clients. Some even specialized in photographing the city from the building's windows, capturing sweeping views of Madison Square and selling prints to tourists and collectors.
Lawyers, too, found a home there. Smaller practices thrived in single offices, benefiting from both privacy and proximity to the courts and business districts. Through it all, the Flatiron endured. It adapted without losing identity. It remained relevant even as the skyline soared beyond it. It balanced practicality with poetry, steel and terracotta shaping not just a building, but a symbol. What began as an awkward triangle carved by a stubborn diagonal road became a permanent fixture in the imagination of a city. The winds still swirl around its narrow edge, the sunlight still strikes its facade in shifting colors. And for decades, behind those windows, life moved steadily forward, proof that even the strangest foundations can support something timeless. For decades, the Flatiron Building was more than just an office block. It was a symbol of ambition, elegance, and New York's relentless energy. But behind its instantly recognizable triangular silhouette, a quieter story was unfolding. A story of adaptation, survival, and the growing tension between history and progress. In its early years, the Flatiron attracted a distinctive mix of tenants. Larger firms often leased entire floors, while smaller professional offices filled individual suites. A shared law library served multiple tenants, allowing them to split maintenance costs, a practical solution that reflected the building's collaborative spirit. Its corridor layout provided discrete entrances to separate offices, something clients seeking privacy deeply appreciated. Even during the 1930s, as economic uncertainty swept across the nation, the tenant mix remained surprisingly consistent. Creative industries, professional services, and businesses seeking a prestigious address without vast square footage continued to call the Flatiron home. It never competed with the newest skyscrapers in terms of size or capacity. Instead, it offered something rarer: character, history, and instant recognition. When the Great Depression struck, rental patterns shifted, but not as dramatically as one might expect. Some businesses failed, others downsized, yet the building remained attractive enough to quickly replace departing tenants. Rent became flexible during hard times. Owners preferred accepting lower payments over risking prolonged vacancy. Survival required pragmatism.
The Second World War brought another transformation. Government agencies leased office space throughout Manhattan to support military operations, and the Flatiron accommodated several smaller offices tied to the war effort. After victory was secured, these spaces returned to civilian use, and the post-war economic boom ushered in a fresh wave of commercial tenants. By the 1950s, the building had reached its 50th anniversary. Structurally, it remained strong. Its steel skeleton was solid, a testament to early 20th century engineering. The terracotta facade had weathered decades of wind, rain, and snow, though moisture had cracked some panels that required replacement. Inside, however, time was beginning to show. Elevators needed increasingly frequent repairs. Steam heating still functioned, but it lagged behind modern systems in efficiency. Plumbing occasionally failed. Owners invested in ongoing maintenance, but stopped short of major upgrades. The broader economy did not justify large capital expenditures. Radical renovations would have cost millions and possibly required evacuating tenants during construction. The financial risk seemed too high. Then, in the 1960s, preservation became a public cause. New York was losing architectural treasures at an alarming rate. The demolition of Pennsylvania Station in 1963, an architectural masterpiece, sparked outrage across the city. In response, activists pushed for stronger protections. The New York City Landmark Preservation Commission was established in 1965. In 1966, the Flatiron Building received landmark designation. The status protected it from demolition and required official approval for any significant changes to its facade or key interior elements. Owners no longer could tear it down, even if the land beneath it became more valuable than the structure itself. The designation preserved the building's iconic identity, but it also imposed constraints. Renovations required oversight. Exterior alterations faced scrutiny. From a preservation standpoint, the regulations made perfect sense. They shielded the triangular landmark from careless decisions. Yet they also reduced flexibility at a time when office needs were rapidly evolving. By the 1970s and 1980s, corporate expectations had shifted dramatically. Companies wanted open floor plans. Computers demanded specialized electrical systems and cooling infrastructure. Air conditioning was no longer optional, it was essential. The Flatiron, with its small offices, aging wiring, and inconsistent climate control, struggled to compete. Modernizing the building would have required opening walls and installing entirely new systems throughout its narrow floors. Some spaces became harder to lease. Large corporations seeking modern facilities looked elsewhere. Smaller firms with modest infrastructure needs remained, but occupancy fluctuated. Owners managed to operate profitably, though margins tightened. Culturally, however, the building's stature only grew. Films featured it as a quintessential New York backdrop. Travel guides, calendars, and advertisements showcased its dramatic form. Artists painted it. Architecture students analyzed it. Tourists flocked to Madison Square just to stand at its base and look up. Few structures in New York, aside from the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building, achieved such immediate recognition. Yet admiration alone could not cover repair costs. By the 1990s, serious maintenance issues demanded attention. The terracotta facade required extensive restoration. Small cracks widened as water seeped in and froze during winter, accelerating damage. Some panels loosened, posing real danger to pedestrians below. Scaffolding wrapped portions of the building as repairs began. Inside, the original elevators, remarkably durable after nearly a century, could no longer continue. They required full replacement, including modern motors, cabs, and control systems. Electrical wiring was outdated, never designed to power computers, fax machines, and modern office equipment. Plumbing systems also needed upgrades. While owners ran new cables where possible, a complete overhaul would have meant dismantling walls throughout the structure. Ownership changed hands multiple times in the final decades of the 20th century. Each new owner inherited the same complex equation: a prestigious address and iconic architecture paired with aging systems and strict landmark regulations. Rental income remained steady but not spectacular. It was rarely enough to justify the tens of millions required for comprehensive renovation. By the late 1990s, a troubling pattern had emerged. Publicly, the Flatiron was celebrated as a symbol of New York. Privately, it was underfunded and aging. Everyone admired it. Few were willing to finance its revival. Deferred maintenance accumulated year after year, and the cost of inaction steadily increased. As the 21st century began, the Flatiron Building stood at a crossroads, beloved, historic, and structurally resilient, yet burdened by the very protections that preserved it. The question was no longer whether it mattered. That was unquestioned. The real question was whether one of New York's most iconic landmarks could adapt once again, or whether its greatest challenge still lay ahead. By the late 20th century, the Flatiron Building faced a challenge it had never encountered before. Not economic collapse, not war, but irrelevance. The modern workplace had evolved, and the iconic triangular tower was struggling to keep pace. Corporate offices no longer resembled the compartmentalized spaces of the early 1900s. Open floor plans had become the standard. Companies wanted expansive environments where dozens of employees could collaborate freely without the physical barriers of narrow hallways and enclosed rooms. The Flatiron, with its long, slender corridors and small offices lining each side, represented the exact opposite of what contemporary tenants desired. The building's infrastructure only deepened the problem. Its HVAC systems barely functioned as a cohesive unit. The original steam heating still operated, but it was noisy, inefficient, and impossible to regulate floor by floor. Air conditioning had been added gradually over decades, resulting in a patchwork network that delivered inconsistent results. Some offices baked in the summer heat, others felt uncomfortably cold in winter. Complaints became routine. Electrical capacity posed an even greater obstacle. When the Flatiron opened, electricity powered lights and little else. By the 1990s, offices were filled with computers, servers, printers, and electronic equipment that demanded far more circuits than the building could supply. Owners ran new wiring wherever possible, threading cables through existing shafts and corridors. But a complete overhaul would require tearing open walls and ceilings on every floor. The cost would be staggering. The disruption would be immense.
Plumbing, too, revealed its age. Pipes installed during original construction had endured nearly a century, an impressive feat, but no system lasts forever. Leaks became more frequent. Water pressure fluctuated unpredictably. Some bathroom fixtures were older than the tenants who used them. Replacing the entire plumbing network would effectively mean rebuilding the structure from the inside out. Even the elevators, modernized in the 1990s, exposed a structural limitation that could not be solved. The building had only 4 elevator cabs serving 22 floors. During peak hours, workers waited several minutes just to travel up or down. Newer office towers offered more shafts, faster service, and greater efficiency. The Flatiron had no physical space to add more elevators without demolishing essential structural components. Geometry itself had become a constraint. In the 1990s, ownership passed to a prominent New York developer, Harry Macklowe. He understood both the prestige and the predicament. The property occupied approximately 17,000 square feet of some of Manhattan's most valuable real estate. Even with its unconventional shape, the land alone was worth tens of millions. But landmark designation prevented demolition. The building could not simply be replaced with a more profitable tower. Macklowe explored an ambitious alternative, converting the structure into luxury condominiums. The idea was compelling. Apartments inside one of New York's most iconic buildings could command extraordinary prices. Upper floors offered sweeping views of Madison Square and the Manhattan skyline. Historic character would provide an allure no new development could replicate. Yet the obstacles were formidable. Conversion would require reconfiguring every floor. Walls would need to be demolished, kitchens and bathrooms installed.
plumbing lines rerouted, electrical systems entirely replaced. Historic corridors, staircases, and ornamental elements might need preservation under landmark regulations. Approval from the Landmarks Preservation Commission would be essential. The commission rejected the proposal. Officials argued that the building's identity was inseparable from its historic use as an office tower. Converting it to residential units would fundamentally alter that character. Preservation guidelines prioritized maintaining its historical function as well as its appearance. Without condominium conversion, the financial equation no longer worked.
Work was scheduled to begin in early 2019. After more than a century of adaptation, resilience, and deferred maintenance, the Flatiron Building was preparing for its most complex transformation yet, a test not only of engineering, but of whether history and modernity could finally coexist within one of New York's most enduring icons. In early 2019, something unprecedented happened. After more than a century of continuous activity, the Flatiron Building went silent. Tenants received formal notices. The building would close temporarily for a full-scale renovation. They were assured they could return once the work was complete. In March 2019, offices were packed into boxes, desks were cleared, and the last occupants walked out. Some intended to come back. Others used the opportunity to relocate permanently to newer, fully modernized towers. For the first time since its opening in 1902, the Flatiron stood empty. Scaffolding soon wrapped around the triangular facade. Construction crews began the painstaking task of restoring the terracotta exterior. Each panel required individual inspection. Cracks were mapped. Damaged sections were carefully removed. Replacement pieces had to match originals created 117 years earlier, identical in color, texture, and dimension. Finding manufacturers capable of reproducing historic terracotta took months. This was not ordinary construction. It was preservation surgery. Inside, selective demolition began. Non-essential walls were torn down, exposing the building's steel skeleton. Outdated electrical wiring was stripped away. Old plumbing pipes were cut and removed. The plan called for entirely new systems, electricity, HVAC, plumbing, designed for the 21st century but integrated carefully into the historic structure. It was ambitious, complex, and expensive. Then, 1 year into the project, everything stopped. In March 2020, COVID-19 reached New York City. Construction slowed, then halted completely. Workers were sent home. Supply chains collapsed. The city shut down non-essential building projects for months. The Flatiron renovation was suspended indefinitely. But the pandemic's impact extended far beyond the construction site. Tourism vanished almost overnight. Madison Square, once crowded with visitors photographing the building, stood eerily empty. Commercial real estate values dropped sharply as companies embraced remote work. Offices that had once been essential suddenly felt optional. Demand for Midtown Manhattan space evaporated. The Sorgente Group, the Italian real estate firm behind the renovation, faced mounting financial pressure. Even before the pandemic, its parent company carried significant debt. Lockdowns worsened the situation dramatically. Revenue from its global property portfolio declined. Creditors began demanding repayment. In August 2020, the Italian parent company filed for bankruptcy. The Flatiron Building was left in legal limbo. Renovation halted. The building remained vacant. Scaffolding still clung to its facade, but no workers stood beneath it. Ownership fell under the supervision of a bankruptcy court in Italy. Creditors competed for control of assets. Potential buyers evaluated whether acquiring the Flatiron, with its legal complexities, restoration costs, and landmark restrictions, was worth the risk. Months stretched into years. The building remained dark.
Tourists continued to gather outside, cameras raised, but their photos now captured barricades and scaffolding instead of a thriving office tower. A structure that had survived world wars, depressions, and technological revolutions now stood stalled, not by physical decay, but by economics. Yet this crisis did not begin with the pandemic. In the decades before Sorgente's acquisition, a pattern had emerged. Multiple owners recognized the building's immense cultural value, but none found a consistently profitable path forward. The equation rarely changed. Renovation costs exceeded what the building could generate as office space. Residential conversion seemed like the most logical solution. Luxury condominiums inside one of Manhattan's most recognizable landmarks could sell for millions per unit. In the late 1990s, developer Harry Macklowe pursued precisely that vision. The location was unmatched, the prestige undeniable. The numbers appeared to work.
But the Landmarks Preservation Commission rejected the plan. Converting the building into apartments would have required extensive interior restructuring, fundamentally altering its historic office layout. Preservation officials ruled that its identity as an office building was part of its historical character. The decision was final. Another ownership group explored a boutique hotel concept. The logic was compelling. Tourists already flocked to photograph the Flatiron. Why not let them stay inside it? Premium rates seemed achievable. Yet this proposal faced the same obstacle. Hotel conversion would demand significant structural and interior changes, likely triggering regulatory rejection. The idea quietly faded. Meanwhile, the building continued operating as office space, but with declining competitiveness. Traditional firms requiring advanced infrastructure moved elsewhere. Smaller organizations, startups, and creative companies filled some vacancies, drawn more by the address than by amenities. Other floors remained empty for months at a time. Rents stayed relatively modest to maintain occupancy, but lower rents meant lower revenue, and lower revenue meant fewer resources for major repairs. This created a vicious cycle. Deferred maintenance worsened the building's condition. Deterioration made it harder to attract premium tenants. Reduced rental income left even less funding for upgrades. The downward spiral was gradual but persistent. By 2010, the terracotta facade demanded urgent attention. Several panels had fallen, prompting city authorities to require protective scaffolding along the sidewalks. The installation was meant to be temporary. Instead, it lingered for years because owners postponed costly restoration. Inside, problems intensified quietly. The electrical system strained under increasing loads. Some floors experienced power outages. Tenants filed complaints. Spot repairs were performed, but fundamental modernization never occurred. Wiring installed in the early 20th century simply was not designed to power computers, servers, and continuous electronic demand. The HVAC system grew increasingly unreliable. Heating was uneven, cooling inconsistent, comfort became unpredictable. The Flatiron struggle was not dramatic or sudden, it was slow erosion, financial, functional, and structural. A beloved icon admired worldwide was trapped in a paradox. Its historic designation preserved its appearance but limited its adaptability. Its fame elevated its value but did not guarantee profitability. By the early 2020s, New York's most photographed building stood wrapped in scaffolding, empty and uncertain. It had survived for over a century through resilience and reinvention. Now it faced its most complex test yet, not whether it could endure physically, but whether the economics of preservation could align with the realities of modern use. The Flatiron had always been a symbol of innovation. The question was whether it could innovate once again. By the late 2010s, working inside the Flatiron Building had become an exercise in endurance.
During summer, the upper floors felt like ovens. In winter, despite functioning steam heat, some offices were still uncomfortably cold. Tenants relied on portable heaters and desk fans just to make it through the day. It wasn't a real solution, it was a quiet admission that the building's systems were failing. When Sorgente Group purchased the property in 2018, skepticism rippled through the real estate community. The acquisition price was high, the known renovation costs were enormous, and the unknown costs, those hidden behind walls and beneath floors, could be even greater. Still, Sorgente had a reputation for tackling complex historic restorations. They had completed projects others had deemed impossible. Backed by their Italian parent company, they appeared to have the experience and capital necessary to succeed.
But inspections conducted after the purchase revealed the full scale of the challenge. The terracotta facade required far more than minor patchwork. Entire sections needed replacement. Decades of micro-cracks had allowed water to seep inside, corroding parts of the steel framework beneath. Restoring the exterior would require wrapping the entire building in scaffolding and proceeding floor by floor for months, possibly years. The steel skeleton itself, though still structurally sound, demanded careful evaluation. Engineers inspected every beam and column. Where corrosion appeared, crews would need to sandblast and repaint. Some areas might require reinforcement. 117 years of exposure to moisture, wind, and temperature shifts had left their mark. There was, however, one reassuring discovery. The foundations, deep steel piles anchored into Manhattan's bedrock, remained solid. The base of the building required no intervention. It was everything above that would demand extraordinary effort.
Sorgente developed a meticulous, multi-phase renovation plan. Phase 1 focused on the facade, installing scaffolding, inspecting each terracotta panel, replacing damaged pieces, and treating the exposed steel frame. Phase 2 would overhaul electrical and plumbing systems, new wiring, new pipes, new fixtures throughout. Phase 3 called for a modern HVAC system capable of delivering consistent temperature and humidity on every floor. Phase 4 would upgrade elevators with faster, more efficient units. Phase 5 aimed to reconfigure interior spaces, creating more flexible layouts while preserving key historical elements. The entire project was expected to take 3 to 5 years. Estimated costs ranged from $50 million to well over $100 million, depending on unforeseen complications. Financing was secured through a combination of funds from Sorgente's parent company and lenders who believed a carefully restored Flatiron could command renewed value. By March 2019, everything was ready. Permits were approved, contractors were hired, schedules were finalized. Tenants had vacated. For the first time in its history, the Flatiron stood completely empty. Scaffolding rose along the triangular facade. Crews began removing terracotta panels, cataloging each one carefully. Damaged pieces were marked for replication. Intact sections were cleaned and stored for reinstallation. For the first time since 1902, portions of the steel frame were exposed to daylight. Engineers examined the structure closely. To their relief, most of it was in better condition than anticipated, though localized corrosion required treatment. Inside, demolition advanced in non-public areas. Old wiring was stripped out, plumbing was dismantled, mechanical rooms were cleared to prepare for modern equipment. The work was noisy, dirty, and labor-intensive, but it was on schedule. Momentum was building. Then, in March 2020, everything changed. The COVID-19 pandemic reached New York City, and construction sites across the city went dark. Workers were sent home, non-essential projects were suspended. The Flatiron renovation froze in place. What was expected to be a short pause stretched into months. Even after restrictions eased, new safety protocols limited worker density. Progress slowed dramatically. Materials ordered from international suppliers were delayed or canceled altogether. Global supply chains unraveled. Carefully designed schedules became meaningless. But construction delays were only part of the crisis. The economic impact of the pandemic hit Sorgente even harder. Across Europe and the United States, properties within their portfolio suffered steep revenue losses. Restaurants, retail spaces, and offices closed. Tenants struggled to pay rent. Property values declined. A company that had seemed financially secure in 2018 faced mounting pressure by mid-2020. Sorgente's parent company already carried significant debt. As revenues fell, creditors grew impatient. Loans that once appeared manageable became urgent liabilities. Cash reserves dwindled. In August 2020, Sorgente's parent entity filed for bankruptcy in Italy. The Flatiron Building, owned by Sorgente's American subsidiary, became entangled in complex bankruptcy proceedings. An Italian court assumed authority over the company's assets. Creditors filed claims. Potential buyers began assessing whether the landmark could be acquired from the bankruptcy estate, perhaps at a discount. Renovation efforts never fully recovered. Some limited work continued sporadically, but without consistent funding and decisive leadership, meaningful progress stalled. Scaffolding remained wrapped around the facade. The interior stood unfinished and silent. New York's most photographed building had become its most motionless. The pandemic did more than halt one renovation. It reshaped the economics of commercial real estate throughout the city. Companies that once required centralized offices discovered remote work was viable, sometimes even more efficient than expected. Meetings moved online. Documents lived in the cloud. Productivity, to many managers' surprise, did not collapse. The very concept of the office began to shift. For a building already struggling to justify massive renovation costs as office space, this transformation introduced an unsettling question. Even if restored perfectly, would demand return? The Flatiron had endured for over a century through adaptation. It had survived depressions, wars, technological revolutions, and shifting urban priorities. Yet now it faced a different kind of uncertainty, not structural but economic. Wrapped in scaffolding and suspended between past and future, the iconic triangle stood as both symbol and warning. Preservation required money. Modernization required vision. And in a world redefining how people work, the future of one of New York's most beloved landmarks remained uncertain.
The building had survived 117 years. The challenge now was not whether it could stand, but whether it could once again find its purpose. When the world discovered that remote work could function at scale, the consequences were immediate and dramatic. Companies that once leased entire floors in Midtown Manhattan began shrinking their footprints. Some declined to renew leases. Others renegotiated for smaller spaces. Vacancy rates across the city climbed to levels unseen in decades. For the Flatiron Building, already empty due to renovation, the impact was indirect but devastating. Its future value depended on one critical factor: rental income. If demand for office space weakened permanently, even a fully restored Flatiron might struggle to attract tenants willing to pay rents high enough to justify its massive renovation costs. What had been a difficult financial equation in 2019 became nearly impossible by 2021. Tourism, the second pillar of the building's economic value, also collapsed. Madison Square, once crowded with visitors snapping photos, fell silent. Restaurants closed, hotels emptied. The neighborhood that had amplified the Flatiron's prestige suddenly felt hollow. A prime location means little when no one is there to experience it. Meanwhile, bankruptcy proceedings in Italy dragged through 2020 and 2021. The court overseeing Sorgente Group's collapse worked to untangle assets and distribute proceeds among creditors.
The Flatiron represented both a crown jewel and a burden. It held immense symbolic value, but also staggering renovation costs. Any buyer would inherit not just the building, but the responsibility to finish the restoration. Creditors disagreed about strategy. Some argued for immediate sale, even at a reduced price, to recover whatever funds they could. Others urged patience, believing the market might rebound and increase the building's value. The court weighed competing arguments, yet issued few decisive rulings. The case became mired in legal complexity. And so the building remained in limbo. The scaffolding, originally installed as a temporary safety measure during facade repairs, became a semi-permanent feature. It wrapped the exterior like an unfinished promise. City officials required it to stay in place until restoration resumed, but no one had the authority or funding to restart the work.
Inside, the scene was surreal. Some floors had been stripped down to bare steel mid-demolition when construction halted. Others remained almost untouched, frozen as tenants had left them in 2019. Desks still stood in certain offices. Filing cabinets held forgotten documents. It looked as if everyone had stepped out for lunch and never returned. Security became a growing concern. An empty 22-story building in Midtown Manhattan attracts attention. Urban explorers sought entry. Graffiti artists looked for canvases. Individuals experiencing homelessness searched for shelter. Guards were hired to patrol the property, but maintaining round-the-clock security across so many floors was costly. Entrances were boarded. Access was restricted. The city began intervening more aggressively. The Department of Buildings issued violations for neglected repairs. The terracotta facade continued to deteriorate. More panels cracked. The risk of falling debris increased. Officials threatened fines if work did not resume, but enforcing action against a bankrupt entity proved complicated. Within the architectural community, alarm grew. The Flatiron Building was one of the defining landmarks of America's early skyscraper era. Its bold, triangular form had inspired structures worldwide, proving that creativity could triumph over constrained urban lots. Allowing it to decay would represent not just a local loss, but a global one. Preservation groups explored possible intervention. The National Trust for Historic Preservation added the Flatiron to its list of endangered landmarks. Local advocates examined fundraising options, but the numbers were daunting. Raising $100 million or more through donations alone was unrealistic. Any viable solution would require a private investor with deep resources and long-term vision. Several potential buyers conducted due diligence. One by one, they walked away. The math rarely worked. Purchase price plus renovation costs plus uncertain leasing prospects equaled enormous risk. Investors seeking reasonable returns within a predictable time frame found little reassurance. By 2022, the situation had settled into a troubling equilibrium. Nothing improved, yet nothing collapsed entirely. The building stood, the scaffolding stood. Legal proceedings continued at a slow pace. Negotiations between interested parties and the bankruptcy court produced no breakthroughs. The Flatiron had become an icon suspended in time, unable to move forward, unwilling to fade away. As travel gradually resumed, tourists returned to Madison Square. They photographed the building as they always had, but now their images included metal barriers and weathered scaffolding. Nearby souvenir shops sold postcards depicting the Flatiron in pristine glory, without reference to its present condition. The contrast between memory and reality was striking. Local newspapers revisited the story every few months. Each article sounded familiar. The building remained empty. The bankruptcy case was unresolved. Renovation had not resumed. Prospective buyers were evaluating options but submitting no firm offers. The narrative rarely changed. By 2023, new tensions surfaced. Some creditors argued that prolonged delay was eroding the asset's value.
The longer the Flatiron remained vacant, the harder it would be to re-establish momentum. Meanwhile, the broader office market in New York showed only modest recovery. Remote work persisted. Many companies had permanently reduced their space requirements. Fresh negotiations began. Certain creditors pushed to lower the asking price, hoping to attract serious bidders. Others objected, insisting that selling at a depressed value would unfairly disadvantage those owed money. The court listened, considered proposals, and moved cautiously. Then, in 2024, signs of possibility emerged. Reports surfaced that a group of New York developers was forming a consortium to pursue acquisition. The rumored plan involved completing the long-delayed renovation and exploring a mixed-use model, blending offices with cultural or educational spaces. Such a strategy could diversify revenue and reduce reliance on traditional office tenants. Whether this consortium will succeed remains uncertain, but for the first time in years, the conversation shifted from stagnation to potential revival. The Flatiron Building has endured for more than a century because it represents more than real estate. It embodies innovation, resilience, and the boldness of early skyscraper design. Today, it stands as both a cautionary tale about economics and a testament to architectural endurance. The question is no longer whether it deserves to be saved. That is universally agreed. The question is who will step forward and whether they can finally align vision, preservation, and financial reality.
By early 2025, the future of the Flatiron Building remained unresolved. Negotiations continued behind closed doors. The structure was still controlled by an entity under the supervision of an Italian bankruptcy court. Potential buyers circled cautiously. The city issued violations. Preservation groups monitored every development, and the Flatiron stood silent, its windows dark, its corridors empty, caught in the longest suspension of its 122-year history. At the center of this crisis lies a paradox. The Flatiron was granted landmark status because it is architecturally and culturally significant. That protection was intended to guarantee its survival, yet the very regulations designed to preserve it have made profitable adaptation extraordinarily difficult. The building cannot be demolished, but it also cannot be easily transformed to meet modern demands. The economics are unforgiving. A renovation exceeding $100 million must ultimately generate enough income to justify the investment. In ideal market conditions, office space inside the Flatiron could command premium rents due to its location and prestige, but the building does not offer what today's companies prioritize. Open floor plans are nearly impossible within its triangular geometry and preserved corridor layout. Integrating advanced technological infrastructure into a structure conceived before computers, air conditioning, or digital communication is a logistical puzzle layered upon strict regulatory oversight. Even if these technical obstacles were overcome, another question looms: demand. The post-pandemic office market in New York has fundamentally shifted. Many companies now require less space. Remote work remains embedded in corporate culture. Vacancy rates across Manhattan's Class A buildings remain elevated. Competition for tenants is intense. A fully restored Flatiron would compete with newer towers offering state-of-the-art systems, expansive layouts, and modern amenities, often at comparable or lower rents. Residential conversion once appeared to be a logical alternative. Luxury apartments in one of New York's most recognizable buildings could command extraordinary prices. Yet the Landmarks Preservation Commission has consistently resisted such proposals. Their reasoning is not arbitrary. The Flatiron has functioned as an office building since 1902. That continuity is itself part of its historical identity. Converting the interior into apartments would fundamentally alter that legacy.
Here, the paradox sharpens. The stricter the protections, the narrower the path to survival. A building that cannot generate sufficient revenue will deteriorate regardless of how many legal protections shield it from demolition. Preservation requires maintenance. Maintenance requires money, and money flows from viable use. If regulations prevent profitable adaptation, decay becomes inevitable, slow perhaps, but relentless. Other historic buildings have faced similar crossroads. The Woolworth Building in Lower Manhattan endured years of financial strain before a developer converted its upper floors into luxury condominiums in 2015. That project received approval in part because the building's original design included mixed residential elements. Precedent existed. The Flatiron has no such precedent. History offers cautionary tales as well. The Singer Building, once the tallest in the world, was demolished in 1968 before preservation laws could protect it. Pennsylvania Station fell in 1963, sparking public outrage and directly leading to the creation of New York's landmark preservation framework. Those losses reshaped public consciousness. Saving buildings from demolition became a civic priority. Now, preservationists face a more complicated challenge. Preventing destruction is only the first step. Ensuring long-term economic vitality is far harder. Some experts argue that preservation regulations must evolve. Rigid adherence to original use can condemn structures to stagnation. Thoughtful flexibility, allowing adaptive reuse while safeguarding key historic elements, might offer a path forward. Others caution that excessive flexibility could invite erosion of the very qualities that make these landmarks worthy of protection. Public subsidies represent another possibility. Governments could expand tax incentives, grants, or funding programs for buildings of exceptional cultural importance. New York offers limited assistance for landmark restoration, but nothing approaching the scale required here. A $150 million renovation exceeds what most public initiatives can realistically support for a privately owned property. Public-private partnerships have also been discussed. The city could assume partial control and collaborate with a private developer, exchanging expertise and funding for long-term lease rights or co-ownership. Such models have succeeded elsewhere. But the Flatiron's legal entanglements and financial complexity make negotiations extraordinarily delicate.
The idea of transforming the building into a museum or cultural institution periodically resurfaces. Conceptually, it is compelling. The Flatiron itself is an artifact of early skyscraper innovation. Visitors could experience preserved interiors while learning about the evolution of urban architecture. Yet museums require consistent operational funding. Ticket sales rarely cover expenses. Any cultural conversion would demand a substantial endowment capable of sustaining decades of programming and maintenance. A boutique hotel remains another theoretical path. The building's narrow corridors could adapt naturally to hotel rooms. Guests might pay a premium to sleep within such an iconic structure. Smaller, thoughtfully designed rooms could work within the triangular footprint. The challenge lies in convincing preservation authorities that hotel conversion would respect historical integrity while enabling economic survival. Perhaps the most realistic scenario involves a hybrid model. Lower floors could house offices or cultural spaces. Middle floors might function as a boutique hotel. Upper levels, with their sweeping views of Madison Square and the Manhattan skyline, could potentially accommodate limited residential units if regulators determine such adaptation is essential for preservation. Diversifying revenue streams would reduce dependence on any single market and increase long-term stability. Yet none of these options can move forward while ownership remains frozen in bankruptcy proceedings. The Italian court overseeing the Sorgente estate cannot hold the property indefinitely, but it also cannot finalize a sale until creditors reach agreement. Each delay extends uncertainty. The Flatiron stands as both warning and inspiration. Many buildings have survived crises that once appeared fatal. Mar-a-Lago, for example, faced demolition in the 1980s when maintaining it seemed economically impossible.
It endured because a new model, conversion to a private club, generated sustainable revenue. That transformation was controversial, but it worked. The critical difference lies in regulatory flexibility. The Flatiron's landmark status, while safeguarding its form, limits its adaptability. Protection has become both shield and cage.
There is a final irony. The building's global fame may complicate its salvation. Every proposal for one of America's most recognizable landmarks attracts intense scrutiny. Preservationists, developers, community groups, and public officials examine every detail. The Landmarks Preservation Commission must tread carefully, aware that each decision establishes precedent. Physically, the building remains strong. Its steel skeleton endures. The terracotta facade deteriorates gradually, but not catastrophically. It could stand for decades in its current dormant state. But standing is not the same as living. The Flatiron has become a monument to its own contradiction, too important to disappear, too constrained to adapt easily, too celebrated to evolve quietly. Its emptiness is both tragedy and lesson. Icons are not immortal. Fame does not pay for restoration. Legal protection without economic viability is simply a slower path to decline. Will the Flatiron survive another century? Almost certainly. But will it once again fill with people, purpose, and daily life? That answer remains uncertain. Between those two questions lies the widening gap between preservation and vitality, a gap that grows with each year the triangular tower waits in darkness, suspended between history and possibility.